Welcome to this evening's event. My name is Scott Wall. I'm the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost here at UCLA. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. It's a wonderful opportunity for me, very selfishly, because it's honoring two people who I've loved very dearly in my life. And the official reason for this is to install Teo Ruiz as the inaugural chairholder of the Robert and Dorothy Wellman Endowed Chair in Medieval History. This is a wonderful chair that was given by Robert, and mainly it was given by Dottie, his wife. And Robert was a long time, they were both long-time UCLA people. They met here as undergraduates and got married. Bob was a sociology major, and Dottie was an English major, and she graduated in English. Bob was disabled, and he became the first compliance officer at UCLA for the Americans with Disability Act, and served in that position for a long, long time, to some extent unheralded, and that will play in what I have to say in a moment. Dottie, he retired in 1988. And sometime around then, I have to start off by admitting that I'm a terrible historian. I cannot keep chronology straight. But somewhere in the 80s, Dottie started taking courses of mine, and she started auditing them. And she was in lecture after lecture. She was a little hesitant about sitting in on seminars with undergraduates. She felt that they would be terrified by having an elderly lady in the room. But actually, it was great. And all of those who lecture here know how wonderful it is to have returning students in the classroom, because they have a perspective on things and an understanding that undergraduates, as bright as they are and as wonderful as they are, just don't have that edge of experience, which is really important in history. So I got to know Dottie quite well, and we worked together. She loved history, and she was absolutely passionate about history. She loved English medieval history, but she loved medieval history generally, and it was something that she pursued. She read on her own, and it was a real passion that she had. She was also irascible and had a very impish, puckish-like smile and disdained things like Republicans and older people and things like that. Dottie, at some point, after Bob died, when she was a widow, she sold their house in the Pacific Palisades and decided to go to a retirement home in Medford, Oregon, which was an odd choice, and she immediately discovered that it was an odd choice because she was surrounded by people that she was unfamiliar with. But she kept up her pursuits, and I finally visited her in Medford at some point around the turn of the century. And she was just, she would foment about there was nobody to talk to, there was nothing to do, it was culturally backward, and so on. And so after I visited her, I got, I think, one of the most eloquent letters I've ever gotten in my entire life from her. Actually, this was the second time I visited her. I went with Steve Jennings, and we had a lovely time. We went out to dinner at some place that she had found, which was a kind of Thai fusion place. Only could she have found it in Medford. But in any case, the letter that she wrote right after that said, "Dear Scott, come back, come back." I've never been so pleased in my life to get a letter from her. But she continued, and I saw her again on another visit, determined to see her, and she was just, reading all the time. I gave her some books from UCLA professors, and which she enjoyed reading, and she was still enjoying watching videos of great professors. She wrote after that occasion, and this will give a sense of what she, sort of her personality a little bit, and how she felt about where she was in life. Actually, with all of the walkers, canes, etc., I better get my glasses, geez, age, etc., ad nauseum around here, just another one makes no difference. What does terrorize them, however, is my knowledge of medieval English history, although it's often hard to squeeze that into a conversation dominated by back pain. I personally love the image of being terrorized by English medieval history. It's something I've never tried. So I was going to visit her again in the fall. We had exchanged a lot of letters, and she talked about the chair. She was very anxious to see the chair established and wanted to make sure that it was filled. And she wanted to make sure it was named after Bob because she said she wanted someplace in that goddamn institution with Bob's name on it. And so I was going to see her after having her importune me to come back. And I did. I went up, and alas, last time I saw her, she died the night before. And it was a real loss. Dottie was one of those characters that's bigger than life and very dear. And she was a great student, a great friend, and a great companion. And I loved her dearly. And I loved her also because of her passion in medieval history. And that's why this is a great occasion, because it matches her passion with the passion of Teo Ruiz. You all know Teo. I could go on and on about his bibliography and his biography. A student of history, a student of medieval history in Spain, culture, and the terrors of history, the winner of the National National Humanities Prize, Carnegie scholar, Carnegie teacher. He combines all the things I think Dottie would have loved. I'm sorry that they never had a chance to meet one another. I'm sorry that Dottie never had a chance to sit in one of Teo's classes, because she would have immediately recognized one of her kin. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first chairholder of the Bob and Dottie Wellman Chair in Medieval History, Teo.
Thank you. Am I supposed to do anything with this? Oh, it's working already. Well, I should begin by thanking all of you for coming, but especially Scott Waugh, because what he failed to say in his introduction and evocation of Dorothy Wellman is that there is a chair in the name of Robert and Dorothy Wellman because she was so unbelievably overwhelmed and transported by Scott's abilities to teach. And becoming an administrator meant a great loss for history students, for the university, and so on, and a great gain because he's such a capable administrator. So I want to thank, first of all, Scott, Laura Gomez, who could be doing better things than being sitting here, Steve Arendt, who's saying, and the many students and friends who have come from cruises. I have two people from Cruises and Travel, and Dorothy and Stanley, and all kinds of friends here. So I am very grateful for coming here. I don't know that Dorothy would have given a chair if she would have sat in my classes. But certainly she sat in Scott's classes, and that led to the chair. I was asked, what would you like to do? So I offered Peter Evans and others the chance of doing either a read lecture, a kind of a scholarly paper, and Peter Evans flinched and said, people will disappear immediately from the room. They will all fall asleep. No. So I am giving something which is a kind of free-flowing, extemporaneous, more or less the way I teach in the classrooms. Now, when I teach at the classroom, one of the things I do is that I run all over the room and mostly trying to see if the students are visiting porno shops, porno things, or playing solitaire or Facebook. So I am always patrolling the borders, which is not the case here. And my wife told me that if I go on the side, all the people in the front will have to sort of turn their necks and they will hate me for it. So I will try to confine myself to this space here. So we should begin at the beginning. And this is the way I begin all my classes. And I begin all my classes with this image. And this image is an image from Paul Klee, something that he called the Angelus Novus, the new angel. And in fact, this past summer, it was an exhibit at the Pompidou. And we went there, and to my amazement, this painting is very small. And it's the only time in which I have asked to be photographed next to the painting. And I don't even know where that photo is, but I should put it on my door because I talk about the angel of history all the time. Walter Benjamin, an essayist, a sociologist, someone who made important interventions into the postmodern kind of discourse, wrote a series of excerpts with which I begin all my lectures. No matter what I am teaching, I always begin there. The first one is a critique of historicism. And in it, he argues that there is no monument of civilization that is not at the same time a monument of barbarity. That every great monument of civilization has been paved with the toil and the agonies of the many. And that history, something that is so obvious as to be essentially commonplace, the history is always written by the winners, that the vanquished has no history, which is why he commands us, historians and people in general, to always brush history against the grain, to write the history from below, which is what I'm going to try to do here. In his other excerpt, he has seen this painting, and he says that he likes to think of the angel, which is a ghastly angel, if you can think of one. This ghastly angel, he likes to think of it as the angel of history. And the angel of history stands on top of a hill, and he looks into the past. His back is towards the future. And he sees in front of him the accumulations, the debris of all genocides and holocausts and oppressions and inequality, and Trump getting off the Paris Treaty, and all the things that really make history something filled with terror. And he wants to stop and put an end to this, but a wind is blowing from paradise, and he has caught in his wings and is propelling him inexorably into the future. That pile of debris that continues to go skywards is what Walter Benjamin tells us, and he should have known because he fled Nazi Germany, came to the Spanish frontier, trying to essentially get his way to Lisbon and to the United States. The frontier was closed, and he killed himself. As he waited, the next day the frontier opened. If he would have just waited one day. That pile of debris, Walter Benjamin tells us, is what we call progress. Why do I begin with this? In Spanish historiography, 1492 has always been seen as a miracle year. It's the year of the conquest of Granada, the end of Muslim presence in the peninsula. It's the year in which Nebrija wrote and published the Arte de la Gramática, the first grammar written and edited and published in Europe. It was the vernacular language. It is a year that has always had a great deal of resonance in terms of Spanish historiography. But what I want to do is look at 1492 not from the viewpoint of the victors, but from the viewpoint of the defeated, of the vanquished. So, let us begin with this is a map of California. One of the things that I will disabuse you of several notions, and one of them is the idea that there is anything called Spain in this period. There is not. There will not be Spanish kingdom or a Spanish nation. In fact, there is not one now, not until the 18th century, and it's imposed from above. So in 1492, you have several kingdoms. The main kingdom is the kingdom of Castile-Leon that occupies most of the western part of the peninsula. There is, of course, Portugal there. And then a strange political entity called the Crown of Aragon that consisted of 3 different units, each one with its own law, its own parliament, even its own language. The Kingdom of Aragon, the County of Catalonia, and the Kingdom of Valencia. They will not be united. And so the story that I tell here is mostly the story of Castile-Leon. Because, for example, people were not allowed to come to the New World unless they were Castilians. So, in fact, they controlled the access to the New World through Seville and the Casa de Contratación in Seville. So, here is where we begin. From the middle of the 13th century to the second half of the 15th century, the Kingdom of Castile sank into all kinds of civil wars, royal minorities, which are always very wicked because it allows a high nobility to run amok, and all kinds of problems. In 1469, the heir, or one of the heirs to the throne of Castile, Isabella, or Isabel, married against the wishes of his half-brother, Henry IV, Ferdinand of Aragon. In 1474, she came to the throne. In 1479, Ferdinand became the king of the crown of Aragon. This is not a union of the crowns. This is a kind of dynastic marriage. Each of the kingdoms retain their own laws, retain their own customs, their own jurisdiction. Isabella was far too strong and cunning to allow Ferdinand, who was a great ally and a very cunning king, to essentially rule unimpeded in Castile. She always kept her hand on whatever matters. The reality is that from 1476, at the Cortes of Madrigal, they began a series of reforms that will restore order to the Kingdom of Castile, but not to Aragon, which was left alone to its own devices, very much as it is now with Catalonia and so on, and neglected until essentially it was so neglectful that it ended up with the secession of Catalonia in 1640. The Catholic monarchs restored order. They had several programs in mind. One of them was essentially to take over Granada and end the Muslim presence in Iberia. On the night of January 1st, 1492, the King of Granada, from the night of January 1st to the 2nd of January, the King of Granada, Boabdil, surrendered the city to the Catholic monarchs. We have the descriptions of this. The Queen cried as she saw the banners of Castile, not the banners of Aragon, the banners of Castile over the Alhambra, which was the residence of the kings of Granada. Granada was a very rich prize. And so this is the beginnings of a moment. Now, the dealings with Muslims that were in the Kingdom of Granada was very simple. There was, as it was the practice in the Iberian Peninsula, a kind of ability for the people to retain their religion, their property, and so on. There was a sort of a surrender treaty that guaranteed the rights of Muslims. Now, what about the Muslims? The Muslims, as you know, came into the peninsula in 711, which is not a place where you go to get your Slurpees, but a date. They actually were quite shaken by this because they came in two small expeditionary attacks against the peninsula, and the Visigothic Empire that had been in Spain since the beginning of the 5th century simply collapsed at the presence of these people. Islam has been growing since the death of the Prophet in 632, and they had expanded out of Saudi Arabia, what is today Saudi Arabia, of Arabia, into the whole Mediterranean area, have conquered most of North Africa, and in 711 crossed the Straits of Gibraltar. Actually, they didn't cross the Straits of Gibraltar. They came from the Atlantic side of what is today Morocco, landed in southern Spain, and essentially dismantled, for all practical purposes, the Visigothic kingdom. They advanced all the way into France. In 732, they met these Frankish armies at the Battle of Poitiers. You could imagine the alarm of these Muslims who are used to sophisticated tastes, who live in a world of gardens and running water, and then they saw all these Germans with long hair who have not taken a bath in years, and they say, we don't want any of this. So they actually withdrew. They went back to the Iberian Peninsula, and eventually, because of a series of famines in 752, they moved back south of the Duero River, south of the area where Madrid is today, and established their rule there. And the rule of Islam in the peninsula was certainly in the 8th and 9th century, and even into the 10th century, a period of extraordinary progress, extraordinary luxury, and so on, which can be seen in some of the buildings they built. The Mosque of Cordoba, which is one of these extraordinary places, a forest of arches. The only thing that is really ridiculous is that when the Christians conquered the city in 1236, they plunk a cathedral inside the mosque of Cordoba, which is a very Mediterranean tradition. That is to say, you always take the places of worship of your enemies and turn them into your own place of worship. But it is the ugliest thing on earth. And if I ever win the lottery, I will destroy it. I assure you, it is terrible. It's a terrible, terrible place. By the beginning of the 10th century, what has been an emirate part of the entire Muslim world, the Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, broke away from the caliphate in Baghdad because the Umayyads, the people who ruled there, had been expelled by the Abbasids. They came to Spain and created a caliphate. Cordoba in 800 or 900 was a city with over 100,000 inhabitants, with the schools, with lights in the streets in the evenings. You could send mail to the Black Sea, to the Khazar Empire, and it will get there, unlike the letters that I send to New York that never get there. So essentially, this is quite an advanced world. But it's also a world that, at least in this period, allowed the dhimmis, the people protected by Islam, Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians, to practice their religion as long as they essentially pay taxes, admit to the superiority of Islam, and live in this world. And essentially what you have is that the courts of the caliphs in Cordoba became a center, a learning center, where Muslims and Christians, speaking and writing in Arabic, developed great and important works, literary works, but also scientific works. It is the golden age of Spanish Jewry, and it is essentially, as the great Peter Brown once said, a garden protected by our spears. It's a world protected by Islam. By 1035, however, Islam was on the decline in the peninsula. The caliphate came down, broke into a series of small kingdoms called kingdoms of taifas, and eventually they became, as it were, victims to the advances of Christian kingdoms that have developed slowly in the north. Now the Muslims reached the high point in 1085 when the city of Toledo, which had been one of the great centers of learning and the capital of the Visigothic Empire, fell to the Christians. Now the Muslims in Iberia were caught in this terrible situation because in North Africa, certainly in the Rif Mountains and in the Atlas Mountains, there are fundamentalist groups, Berber groups, that are developing the Almoravids and creating a sort of kind of territorial empires in North Africa. You could call them to come and help you against the Christians, but then these people are really fundamentalists, and Islam in the peninsula had become quite lax, drinking of wine, human representation. So you either have your cake or you cannot eat it. So what would you do? They call the Almoravids, they push back the Christians. Fortunately, as it is always the case, the Almoravids, when you go to Spain, the Almoravids will become corrupt in time as well. This will be repeated again later on when the Almohads, who are far more formidable than the Almoravids, come into the peninsula and push back the Christian advance. In 1212, however, at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, the Christian armies defeat a great Almohad army, captures the treasury, and essentially solve once and for all the future of the peninsula. It was very clear from now on who is on top. The Christians were on top. And after 1212, a series of pejorative representations of Muslims, a series of laws that are passed by the Cortes of Castile begin to be put into place. Again, something that was unheard of in the history of the combats or relationship between Muslims and Christians, because it was never really a religious conflict. It was Christians fought on the side of Muslims against other Muslims or against other Christians, and vice versa. But after 1212, certainly after 1215, in many respects, motivated by the harsh articles of the Four Lateran Council, the conditions have changed. The Christians are now on top, and they are not easy masters. The first thing they do is to expel in Castile all of the Muslims from the cities. All the Muslims in Seville were expelled. And in 1264, when they rose up in arms, they will be expelled from the countryside as well. So, after 1264, there are no Christians left. I'm saying there are no Muslims left in Western Andalusia. They either have migrated to Granada, they have migrated to the north, which always had a kind of Muslim populations in cities, or they have migrated to North Africa. The Muslims who remain in Castile, where they are mostly engaged in menial activities, because their leadership has fled, have gone elsewhere. The Muslims in Valencia are never expelled from the land. They are turned into a kind of semi-servile agricultural labor. So you could see essentially that the role of Islam becomes smaller and smaller as we move into the 15th century. When in 1492, Granada falls to the Christian armies, then although the Muslims are allowed to remain in the area, by 1499, there is a great deal of growing pressure to convert these Muslims to Christianity. They rose in arms, they went to the hills south of Granada, the area which we call the Alpujarra, and when they were defeated by the early 16th century, the Muslims in Castile were forced to convert. Now, Muslims living on the Christian rule, we call them mudéjars. Muslims who have converted to Christianity, even though it was only a nominal conversion, were called moriscos. In the 16th century, the Catholic rulers of Castile and the Crown of Aragon really neglected the Muslims because they didn't count. They were agricultural labor, they provided inexpensive labor, and so on. By 1560, when they have already dealt with the conversos, the Catholic rulers, Philip II, passed a series of very vitriolic laws in which they forced the Moriscos to learn Castilian, because they only spoke Arabic, to dress like Christians, and to eat like Christians. And if they failed to do so, the children were to be taken away from them and given to Christian families to be brought up as Christians. So it's a harsh method of assimilation. Of course, the Moriscos were very rebellious, and they rose up in arms, and for 2 years they held at bay the best army in Europe. They were defeated, many of them sold into slavery, taken out of the area of Granada, which was repopulated with the Christian population. Some of them were killed, and they were dispersed throughout Castile. They still did not assimilate. So because of the Ottoman threat, essentially the Moriscos were always seen as a fifth column within Spain. And in 1609 to 1619, around 300,000 Moriscos from Castile, but from the Crown of Aragon, were expelled from the country. They were nominally Christians. They are not allowed to remain. Most of them went to North Africa. 1492 was a terrible year for the Islamic population of Iberia. 3 months after the conquest of Granada, on 31st March 1492, the Catholic monarchs decided that they were going to expel the Jews. Some people like Henry Kamen have argued that the edict of expulsion was an edict of assimilation. That is to say, they are given the opportunity to convert to Christianity, but if they don't, they have 3 months to leave Spain, and then before they went to Portugal, North Africa, Rome, and other places around the Mediterranean, and eventually to Amsterdam, to the Low Countries, or to the Ottoman lands. Jews have been in Iberia from the first century of the Christian era. There are mentions of them in the councils of Elvira of the 4th century. The Jews have lived in the kind of end of the Roman Empire, and when Spain was conquered by the Visigoths at the beginning of the 5th century, they had to face rather harsh edicts against them. In fact, in some eerie way, many of the edicts passed by the Visigothic Church and by the Visigothic councils in the 6th and 7th century will be replicated again in the 13th century. The Jews were on the very point of being expelled from Spain in 711 when the Muslim conquest took place. So in many respects, the Muslim conquest was something that saved the Jewish population. Now, the Jews prospered mightily under Islam until the breakdown of the Caliphate. And after the breakdown of the Caliphate, and when you begin to have all these fundamentalist groups from North Africa coming into the peninsula, the period of toleration, if we can use the word for the Middle Ages, the period of accommodation, of conveniencia, not convivencia, but conveniencia, convenience, came to an end. So many of the Jews went to northern cities, in Castilian cities, in Aragonese and Catalan cities. There they had essentially exemption from the jurisdiction of the cities because they were property of the king. They are serfs of the king, pay taxes to the crown, and they were important in financial transactions and as an important economic factor in Castile. Please, another stereotype that has to be smashed. Jews were not forced into one series of trade. You find them in all the economic positions. You find them as farmers, as soldiers, as doctors, as bankers, as royal agents, and so on. They lived wherever they want in the city. But what is very clear is that the economic structure of each of the towns determined, to a large extent, the economic structure of the Jewish community. If the people who rule the town are engaged, Christians who rule the town are engaged in banking and usury, because Christians also lend money at interest, or in long-distance trade, Jews will be found in other activities. If the ruling elite, like that of Avila, derives most of its income from land rents and from the transhumans, the Jews will fill all kinds of niches in terms of arts and crafts and shops and mercantile activities. All this became also, again, by the middle of the 13th century, there is a great deal of pejorative representations of the Jews, and you could see that in the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which date from the second half of the 13th century. There is laws attempting to segregate them from the Christian population, to penalize them for their economic activities, and all that. Most of these laws were never really applied. The reality is, of course, that the life of Jews in the peninsula became quite precarious from 1250 onwards. There are bouts of violence. There are millenarian beliefs, which is why the great book on Kabbalah, which is a Zohar, is written in late 13th century Castile, because the sense of doom and impending. But there is also the reality that many of these Jews have become enticed, which is a charge that is raised against them, by the attractions of Aristotelian philosophy and by the commentaries of people like Ruiz and Avicenna. That they have become less pious and more assimilated into the world of Castile. Hebrew is barely used. It's used sometimes for liturgical purposes or for polemical purposes. There are some significant conversions that take place. There is a ritualization of violence, which the great David Nidenberg has shown how it was used to essentially maintain the society going. You have people entering a city, and the Jews and the Muslims come out with the Quran and the Torah in their hands, dancing to receive princesses or princes that are coming from outside. No one expected what happened in 1391. In 1391, there is a wave of violence throughout the peninsula, which led, not everywhere, but in most places, to massive conversion. This is unprecedented in Jewish history. Perhaps as many as 60% of the population of the peninsula, the Jewish population of the peninsula, converted to Christianity. Some were killed, some did so by threat, some did so voluntarily. The greatest case is the case of Seloma Halevi, the very learned rabbi of Burgos, the greatest rabbi in all of the peninsula, who in 1390, before the violence began, converted to Christianity, went to Paris, went to the University of Paris, studied at the University of Paris theology, became a priest, went to Avignon, became a papal secretary, then became a bishop in Spain and ended up as Bishop of Burgos. He had the wisdom of having 12 children before he became a bishop. And all his children became either bishops or learned men, and they were all in the court. This is the great family of the Santa Maria that were declared to be exempt from the statute of cleanness of blood because the blood was purer than any blood on earth. And this is a formidable family that will have a great deal to say at the Council of Trent. This is the family of the Cartagenas. In 1429, the son of the Bishop of Burgos, by that time, Seloma Halevi, or Pablo de Santa Maria, which was his Catholic name, defended the honor of the city in a famous pas d'armes. So you could see how bizarre this is, that the son of a Jew who has converted to Christianity, who has become a bishop, becomes a defender of the city of Burgos. So you could see the kind of social mobility and social kind of flux that exists in the period. Now, it would be incorrect to think that all the conversos are the same. First, the Jews who remain Jewish are now located in small towns under the, should we say, the protection of lords. Their economic role disappears. They become really unimportant in the economy of the peninsula. They essentially cease to play a role, but on the other hand, they become far more adept and far more, should we say, committed to their religious beliefs. The conversos come in three flavors. One, the conversos, those Jews at the very top end of the social structure, the people who were very aristocratic, move into the aristocracy without missing a beat. In fact, we know that Ferdinand the Catholic had a converso grandmother. So they actually assimilate very well into the higher levels of society. The conversos at the middling sort of the conversos community, move with a vengeance into the universities. They become the letrados, who are going to be the people who are going to serve the Catholic monarch's bureaucratic needs. They become members of the church. In 1492, half of the monks at the monastery of Guadalupe, which is one of the great monasteries in Extremadura, are of converso origin, or they enter municipal government. Already by 1440, there are great tensions between people who call themselves old Christians as opposed to the people who call themselves new Christians, or who are called new Christians. And there is this incredible bidding to the Pope. We give you so much money if you eliminate all the privileges of the new Christians. We give you so much money if you don't eliminate our privileges. But there is a great deal of tension growing up, and this is going to lead eventually to the Inquisition. Now, please understand, in Castile, there have never been an Inquisition. The Catholic, the Christian, the kings of Castile has always looked with suspicion at the idea of having an Inquisition. There was an Inquisition in Aragon, which was a papal Inquisition, or a diocesan Inquisition, the bishop's Inquisition. But in Castile, it was not so. In 1484, for reasons that are not always very clear, and about which historians debate all the time, the Inquisition was created. But this Inquisition was a very different fish. It was the Inquisition under the thumb of royal authority. And in many respects, it became an instrument of royal power to essentially reach out to every part of the country, because the Inquisition was truly the only national institution in the Iberian Peninsula. The Inquisition was led at its beginning by a famous converso from a famous converso family. The famous Tomás de Torquemada was himself of a converso origin, people who had converted in 1391. But the Inquisition went specifically, the first Inquisition in Castile is directed against conversos. Please understand, The Inquisition has no jurisdiction over Jews or over Muslims. The Inquisition has only jurisdiction over Christians. These are people who are accused of practicing Judaism, and the people who become the targets of this is the people that I did not mention. The people at the top, the people at the bottom. The people in the middle, the people at the top. The people at the bottom remain in their neighborhoods, marry endogamously, maintain their practices and rituals, because Judaism is a kind of ritualization of everyday life, continues going on mostly by women. And these are the people who are going to get the brunt of the attacks from the Inquisition. The inquisitorial activity of Jews and the Inquisition overlap only for 8 years. But the Inquisition is indeed very active in this period. And it's a very theatrical representation of power in this great autos de fe and the burning of heretics, people who have been practicing Judaism in secret. The reality of this is that we do not know. And we can never know who was a Jew in his heart or who is being denounced by members of his own family. Because evidence taken from inquisitorial trials, and these are the best records there are in Europe, is always very doubtful, and it has to be seen very critically. So, essentially, in 1492, for reasons that are also not very clear, because the Catholic monarchs were quite friendly to Jews and had many Jews in their courts and things like that, the Jews are given the option of leaving the peninsula or converting to Christianity. Henry Kamen has argued, although this is something that is very much discussed, that there were 80,000 Jews left in the peninsula and that 40,000 left and 40,000 converted. And some of the people returned afterwards to reconvert to Christianity and to regain their properties. If you go to Toledo and look at 2 synagogues in particular, one is Santa Maria la Bianca, and the other one, which is even far more impressive, the Synagogue of the Tránsito. The bell tower is an addition by Christians who turned it into a church. It is a place built in the 14th century when most of the Jews knew that the future was very uncertain. It's a place of such serene beauty and elegance. You could see the interior of it. Most of it with a great deal of Mudéjar influence, architectural influences. But it's a place of such serenity and beauty that you could see what was lost in 1492, not only by the stamping on the Muslims, but by the loss of the Jewish population, of a plurality of religions, of a plurality of voices. It tells you essentially about the dignity of people who had lived in the peninsula for 1,500 years, and there they have no more. We have time to do the New World? Yes, we do have a little bit. America in 2 minutes. Three months after the Edict of Expulsion, as Columbus was waiting to sail to the Canary Islands across the ocean sea, he saw the Jews who were sailing away from Sepharad to exile that will last until this very day. Now, Columbus sailing to the New World. The truth of the matter is, he was from Genoa. No, he was not from Brooklyn, and he was not from Los Angeles. He was not Jewish, he was not a converso, he was not Greek, he was from Genoa. We know the family, we know the records and all that. He was a great sailor. He had been to Iceland and down the coast of Africa with Portuguese merchants. He had sailed the Mediterranean. He had been to the Canary Islands. So he knew essentially how to sail the sea. But he was not altogether there. He was a little bit crazy. He was a little bit crazy. He commented on prophecies. He sort of invented his signature, and so on. The reality of this is that in 1492, when he presented his crazy plan to reach the Indies, which is why we call the natives Indians, to reach Japan and China by sailing westward, based upon a very inaccurate measuring of the earth, there was no purpose to do this, because let's look at the map. Because the Portuguese have been moving down the coast of Africa, setting depots and factories all along the coast of Africa. Because by 1480s, they have already gone around the Cape of Good Hope, and because they have the way to Calicut and Cochin and all those wonderful places, which essentially was essential, because the Europeans were very keen on reaching directly the East, because the Ottomans did not stop the trade of spices, just made it too costly. And can you imagine living in a world without spices? It's like living in Ireland or England. Sorry about that. And the Portuguese were already there. The Catholic monarchs have nothing to lose. This man is crazy. When he goes to Salamanca, all the doctors in Salamanca said, no, your measure of the earth is really all off. It doesn't really say anything. This is wrong. You are just going to die along the way. And if there would not have been a continent there, he would have died along the way. He bumped into the Americas, which is why I never call it a discovery. What there was to discover, the people who lived there had discovered it before. It was an encounter. It was an encounter that was made possible by new techniques of seafaring, by the use of the astrolabe, by the work of someone like Abraham Sakuto on his Perpetuan Almanac, which shows the declinations of the sun, which allows people to essentially travel and always know the latitude, whether they were in the northern or in the southern hemisphere. And so in late August, he sailed out to the Canary Islands, he replenished his supplies, and then went on his first voyage, which was incredibly boring. First of all, no one in Europe who lived close to the sea believed that the earth was flat. Only students in Barstow believed that. No one did. They all know that the earth was round and so on. So first, Barstow. Barstow is a megalopolis in the center of California. So he bumped into an island in the Bahamas, eventually went to Cuba. I actually, in November, was there where Columbus have seen Cuba for the first time, and went back with two ships. One sort of was wrecked. They built a fort in what is today the Dominican Republic, the first settlement in the Americas. I have to tell you that the Spaniards began to be a little bit frisky with the native women, and they were all killed, as they should have been. And he went back to Spain with 12 natives that he kidnapped, with beautiful plumage, with no spices, and just a few grains of gold. But it was enough of the temptation, and he was a great PR man. He marched from Seville to Barcelona, where the Catholic monarchs were waiting for him in the Plaza del Rey, which is one of the pretty places on earth, and on a stage there, and he showed them, look, this wonderment, these wonderful things, these amazing things, marvelous things that we have found. So the Catholic monarchs Antioch, 17 ships, 1,000 men, a doctor, animals, things to essentially have a crop. And they went not now to essentially to explore, they went now to colonize. And between 1493, which is the second voyage, which is a critical voyage because we have a really trustful account of the voyage, you could see already the complex reactions of the of the Castilians who went in this expedition to the native population. They are either the kind of prelapsarian men, humans before the fall, living in a paradisical world, the natural man, or they were beastly and cannibals and eating of food. Columbus himself recommends that the Caribs be enslaved as a way of paying for this enterprise. In a memorandum he writes to the Catholic monarchs in 1493. The problem with, as the Castilians settled in the Caribbean islands, in the main islands, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and in Hispaniola, or Dominican Republic, this was a disaster. The Spaniards, the Castilians died. They were not used to the diet. The native population was exterminated within one generation. These are people who lived in a kind of hunting and gathering society, and they could not be put to work. They simply could not bear. But they were also the victims of the kinds of epidemics, the sickness that the Europeans brought with them to a population that had not been exposed to these bacteria and these illnesses. By 1510, 1515, this enterprise is a disaster. The great event of the late 15th century is not a settlement in the Caribbean. The great event is, of course, the return of Vasco da Gama from the Malabar coast with a ship laden with peppercorns and cardamom and all the good things which will be sold in the great pepper markets at Antwerp and will bring a colossal fortune to Portugal. This is not working. The Castilians could not adapt themselves to the diet that was necessary in this island. It reminds me of my grandparents. They came from Spain and they are still having these heavy stews and bottles of wine at 2 o'clock in Cuba. And at the age of 50, they all exploded. Because you don't eat like this in the tropics. So there was not much here, except that by 1517, expeditions, and the Caribbean is important because the conquest of the New World, the conquest of Mexico and of Peru, is from the Caribbean, not from Spain. And they first make contact with what was obviously superior civilizations. First with the Mayans, and then, of course, later with the people we call the Aztecs, but who call themselves the Mexica. And here, they found a very different world. Because Tenochtitlan, the great city on the lake, was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. And when Bernal Díaz del Castillo wrote his true history of the conquest of New Mexico, or New Spain, when he wrote that, he recollects as he's sitting in Guayacan late in life, that beautiful spot which is Guayacan, one of the nicest and most beautiful places on earth. He's recalling going through one of the big causeways that lead into the center of the city and seeing all the extraordinary amount of temples and queues and the buildings and the people. And he could not have words to describe this. So the only way he could describe it was by essentially thinking that this was something out of the pages of the Amadis of Gaul, one of the romances of chivalry books of the late 15th century. And so this city is a great city. The Spaniards marched north. I need to rush this up. I want to show you some pictures. The Spaniards marched march west to Mexico City. They are received with a great deal of ambivalence. Let me disabuse you of the notion that the Castilians ever conquer the city of Mexico. They did not. They were not believed to be gods. They knew that they'd die. They could handle firearms. You see how difficult it would be to fire a firearm in the 15th century? By the time you charge your rifle again, your head would have disappeared. They were not afraid of dogs or horses, which the Mexica value the horses very high, but they knew how to kill them too. Tenochtitlan will be conquered because the Spaniards were able to make alliances with other native populations who have been terrorized by the Mexicas' practice of engaging in these flowery wars, in which the purpose of these wars was to conquer, to capture an enemy so that he could be offered in the sacrificial stone in a mock combat and a sliver of his flesh distributed through the Capuli to the clan group. because, as Inga Clindena showed long ago, what makes the Castilians win not only is all this massive amount of native allies, mostly the Tlaxcalans, but also the fact that the Spaniards who have been essentially trained in the wars of Granada and who will become the best army in Europe for the next 150 years, were able to fight as formations. These are the great military reforms of Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, the great captain. Whereas the Mexica, the sense of honor demanded not that you kill the enemy, but that you fight individually against another warrior and conquer him, which the Spaniards were not willing to do, which is why for the Mexica, all these Spaniards were nothing but cowards. So we know the story. Eventually, the Mexica gets tired of this greedy Spanish Castilian presence, and they kill some Spaniards and expel them from the city. This is the Noche Triste, the sad night. And Hernán Cortés, builds ships to essentially sail in the lake and begins the conquest of the city. The city is dying from pestilence, from smallpox. The city is dying from the impetus of all these allies that Cortés had brought with him. And we know that they have to be taken house by house because the Mexica will not give up. Moctezuma, who is not the emperor but the first speaker, is replaced by someone who will not surrender. There is an account in a chronicle collected in Nahua much later, which tells of how they dress a warrior with the quetzal plumes and an obsidian knife and a mace, and he jumps among the Spaniards. And if he wins, the city will be saved. We do not know what the outcome was, but in 1521, the city fell to the forces of the Castilians and the native allies. Cortés, writing his Tercera Carta Relación, a third letter to his emperor, Charles V, tells him of hearing the cries of the Mexica being slaughtered by the Tlaxcalans, and describes them in ways in which he says, these people are inhuman. And when you brand somebody else inhuman, when you remove the humanity from someone else, then you assuage any rational way of preventing their being slaughtered and executed. Missionaries who came into Mexico City 40 years afterwards and saw the great monuments, which you could still see if you go to that great city of Mexico City, they could not believe that the people who lived there, who have been degraded beyond words, could have been the people who built these things. So this is, of course, Moctezuma from the Florentine Codex, which, of course, is the work of Indian or native informers to Christian priests who were essentially ethnographers as well. And then you have more. He had a zoo. The first speaker of the Mexica Empire was the Master of Time, the Lord of Time, and he collected strange things from every corner of the world that he could access, including having a zoo. And then this was the headdress. It was taken to Germany by Charles V. It was brought to the old world by the Spaniards, taking to Germany, where Dürer saw it. And he said, I can paint and I can do wood blocks. That I cannot do. It's an art beyond me. And that, of course, is the translator for Cortés' concubine, Marina, or La Melinche. Mexicans know her by a different name, which I will not advance here. And this, of course, is the way. 1492, when Columbus sailed across the ocean sea, was not a good year for the natives of the New World. Thank you.